A gente vai fazer agora a palestra de encerramento, a última sessão da jornada, mais uma vez com o professor Ramal. Professor, I would like to thank you again for coming to São Paulo and giving us this wonderful seminar you gave us the last 3 days, and for giving us this closing lecture. We're truly happy to have you here. Eu só gostaria de lembrar que, para os interessados, depois da palestra de encerramento, a gente vai ter um jantar de confraternização em que a gente vai discutir a possibilidade de se fundar uma sociedade latino-americana de filosofia intercultural, né? Quem se interessar pode inclusive assinar uma lista ali com e-mail, mandar um e-mail para a gente, mesmo que não possa ir para a janta, para conversar depois melhor sobre isso, a gente montar uma lista. But then, I give you the word, Professor. Thank you very much.
So let me try whether I can manage to within time some of the things. No. Let me sit there. No. Anyway, it's all right.
All right.
Oh, I don't know. But anyway, so in this last lecture, I would like to talk about the following points. First, I will try a type of conceptual clarification of the term intercultural philosophy. And in order to elucidate, I will take 2 steps. What intercultural philosophy is not, and the second, what intercultural philosophy then is. The second point would be the concept of an interculturally oriented fourfold of hermeneutics in the spirit of intercultural philosophy. Third point, fourfold dimension of intercultural philosophy. Then, towards the concept, and that is more important, towards the concept of an interculturally oriented historiography of philosophy, and not only Eurocentric conception of philosophy. And then the 5th point, and that is where I would request you to ask some questions, a few imperatives to be followed in teaching and research in philosophy in world philosophical intercultural context. Then first a few introductory remarks. I'd like to start my lecture with the following question and also remark. How has it come to be that Western philosophy is an essential part of the philosophy curricula in practically all universities in non-European countries? But non-European philosophy is present in Europe through its absence. And this is the question, how does it come? There are various reasons for this anomaly, but none of them is philosophically convincing, especially from the point of view of intercultural philosophy. All the reasons, if they are reasons at all, lie outside the field, like colonialism, cultural imperialism, and racism. And above all, the home-made absolutization and universalization of Western mind. That means Western people, they absolutize their way of thinking. And with the help of colonialism, imperialism, and all that, they succeeded. It is not that Europeans convince non-Europeans that European philosophy is the only philosophy. No, non-Europeans has nothing to say, because all majority of these countries were under the rule of Europeans. How sad it is that we have students of philosophy who graduate and do their BA and MA in philosophy and have never heard the names of non-European philosophers like Nagarjuna, John Seale, Avicenna, Shankar, and so on. And this is in a way really sad, and particularly in the world of today. The central thesis proposed, discussed and defended here is the following. Philosophy as philosophy, philosophy qua philosophy, is nobody's possession all alone. The same applies to the manifold of philosophical systems also, philosophical schools and philosophical traditions. The foregoing judgment is far from being a transcendental, essentially purely formal or analytic. It is not an a priori definition. Philosophy is thus by nature intercultural, and it is not far from the truth to say that intercultural philosophy is rather a tautology, because philosophy has been from the very beginning. You take the case of Greek philosophy in contact with the Egyptians, and the Egyptian in relation with the Persians, and Persians had very good relations with India in the Vedic time before the Islamization of Iran. Intercultural philosophy is thus an overarching concept possessing different directions. An autobiographical note as to how I personally came to an intercultural orientation in philosophy in Germany, where I have been living and teaching for the last more than 40 years. So it is a bit autobiographical, but it is true. During my postdoctoral research at the University of Cologne, Germany, in the first half of 1970, I often heard, even from otherwise very well-informed philosophers, that philosophy is solely and only a Western achievement. Added to this, there was, and still is, the claim that Western mind not only understands itself in the best possible way, but Western mind understands non-Western people better than non-Western people understand themselves. You just imagine John Stuart Mill, one of the best logicians in the empirical tradition, in 1800s, I think 35, there was one question in India. British government was thinking to give India at least a partial freedom, part-time freedom. And then he wrote a letter to the Queen: we should not leave India too early. We should wait till Indian civilization, culture comes to age. And such a great philosopher, otherwise I like him, but you just imagine that he was just thinking Indian culture is not that far, and that's why you should wait. And that was the problem. They went there just to cultivate others. And that is a type of cultural imperialism those days. And it also understands, that is what it says, that it also, that with the Western mind, understand non-Western mind better than it can understand itself. That means Westerners and that understand non-Westerners better than non-Westerners can understand themselves. In one of my seminars I said this could be possible only when the other side is psychically ill. Otherwise it is not. I still vividly remember the rather rhetorical question put to me by a very well-known philosopher during my postdoctoral years at the university. I quote this professor: how can you, and I was meant, how can you, being an Asian and Indian, understand European philosophy so well that you can do your habilitation, that is what I was trying to do, that you can do your habilitation here in Germany and become a Privatdozent and professor? This was a rhetorical question, you know. The answer was there. And then I thought, let me say something, because philosophers normally argue. But if, as a philosopher, even if we argue without having any position, that may go the wrong way. Why? The simple question which struck me was, why this one-way hermeneutic road? If Westerners can understand Indians, Indians could also understand Westerners. That was my problem. Why this hermeneutic monologue? Why this singularization in combination with universalization? I mean, singularization, all right, but universalization should not be there. Why this narrow-minded privileging of one particular gestalt of philosophy? Intercultural philosophy, as I understand and practice it, has its origin in these questions. In his recently published book with the provocative title, Can Non-Europeans Think?, Hamid Dabashi writes, I quote, some leading European philosophers even today have inherited this bad habit of universalizing their particulars. And when they come to say anything about a particular non-European location, they look completely and go out for lunch. Quote ends here. In his A Manifesto for Re-Emergent Philosophy, with a forward-looking, promising future, Ganeri writes, I quote one sentence, this conception of philosophy embodies a type of pluralistic realism, a commitment to the claim that there are many ways to investigate a reality whose existence is independent of human inquiries, a plurality of ways of thinking that cannot be reduced to any one single mode of interrogation, least of all to the colonial use of reason. And that is the word he uses. Colonial reason is still active. Only Western mind is not colonizing in the sense of a political power. And that is where at present the trouble. That is also a hope, because the other countries are not subjected to it. In my attempt to answer the question, what is intercultural philosophy? What is an intercultural philosophical orientation, or what does it mean to philosophize interculturally? I find myself caught up in a very paradoxical situation, which I cannot completely avoid nor fully resolve, for I am an insider and outsider at the same time. It is true that to think from within more than one tradition is a disturbing as well as enriching and rewarding experience. It has been my personal experience that one's belonging to different cultures does not make one unfit to do philosophy interculturally, it rather favors it. All ways of doing philosophy are committed to the one universal regulative idea of Philosophia perennis, the perennial philosophy. This one perennial philosophy must resist the temptation of getting essentialized or ontologized by any one philosophical tradition or school of philosophy, whether it is Hegelianism or the philosophy of Nagarjuna, Lao Tzu, whoever it may be. It is true that universalism in its extreme form pleads for the thesis that it is one and the same Philosophia perennis which all philosophical traditions deal with and provide with different answers. Intercultural philosophical orientation rejects such an idea of Philosophia perennis because it is heavily overloaded with its ontological, speculative, metaphysical, and ideological commitments. Karl Jaspers is one of the very few modern philosophers who seems to interpret Philosophia Perennis in the spirit of an intercultural philosophical orientation. I quote, "It is Philosophia Perennis," he writes, "which provides the common ground where most distant persons are related with each other, the Chinese with the Westerners, the thinkers before 2,500 years with those of the present," unquote. The paradoxical situation just alluded to is also a promising one because the phenomenon of interculturality is not just an intellectual and aesthetic category for me, but quite an existential and experiential one. I suffered under it in the beginning. My Indian culture and education, along with my study of and training in European philosophy for the last 40 years, provide me with the opportunity of doing philosophy in an intercultural perspective and of viewing the one from the point of the view of the other, from a critical distance and instance. You know what has happened till today, every comparison of philosophy took its starting point from Europe. And nobody thought Indians could also critically thematize European philosophy, or the Chinese could do so. So it was all the time, it was one-way road. And now intercultural philosophy wants the road should be two-way road, and both sides can praise, criticize, and this should be the practice, and for this practice we plead here. Intercultural philosophical thinking rejects the idea of the total purity of a culture as a myth, as a fiction. No culture is 100% totally pure. The same applies even to philosophy, which is one of the finest products of human mind and culture. In this context, it is necessary to put one general question: how European, Chinese, Indian, African, or Latin American philosophies justify their being European, Chinese, Indian, African, and Latin American, and at the same time sharing in the universal applicability of the term philosophy. My question is, how come that the adjective European is universal and all other adjectives are limited? Any answer to this question must take into account the cross-cultural elements which go to shape all traditions of philosophy. Intercultural philosophical thinking thus rejects any absolutist and exclusive claim of any philosophical tradition, whether this tradition is Indian, or European, or Chinese, to be in the sole possession of the philosophical truth with capital T. That is the problem, philosophical truth with capital T. Other truths are truths, but not with capital T. Such absolutist claims lead to a narrow culturalism, which is against the open and tolerant spirit of an intercultural philosophical orientation. The general term philosophy possesses both cultural and cross-cultural aspects. The very phrase, the European philosophy, for example, testifies to this fact, for it underlies the universal applicability of the general term philosophy, along with the legitimate use of the adjective European and non-European. The same analysis applies to other phrases like Chinese, Indian, and other philosophies. It is really a historical contingency, depending on extra-philosophical factors, that the adjective European has universalized itself. And this is more or less due to extra-philosophical factors. Now I come to the main point here, intercultural philosophy, what it is not. So there are so many things, and these different descriptions, I have gathered during these years. In the beginning I had only 2 or 3 definitions. Now there are more than 10 or 20. So they just increase somehow. First, intercultural philosophy, what it is not. Intercultural philosophy is not the name of a particular philosophical tradition. Whether this tradition is European or non-European, that doesn't matter. Such a privileged treatment of a particular philosophical tradition leads to provincialism and culturalism, and it stands in the way of a genuine philosophical discourse about culture. And this can happen anywhere, intraculturally or interculturally. Second, intercultural philosophy is also not just an eclecticism of different philosophical traditions juxtaposed together. That we just put together and there is no binding element. Third, intercultural philosophy is also not a mere abstraction. We cannot fix the nature of intercultural philosophy per definition, because definitions, if we define cooking is only this and this, then what can I do against it? Because such analytic definitions, they are not wrong, they don't inform. Because the scientist will say, I am also cooking, but you say, no, I define cooking completely different. And that is more or less a logic which starts from the very beginning in the other way around. Fourth, intercultural, it is also wrong to misread intercultural philosophy as a mere reaction or a makeshift approach in face of the de facto pluralistic situation of philosophical tradition in the global context today. Sometimes students say, because we are living in a globalized world, interculturalism has become a fashion. No, philosophy, the theme of philosophy has always been intercultural. Fifth, intercultural philosophy is also not a matter of aesthetization. That means just getting. I was talking to you, Lucas, that you should be very, very careful. The moment you say, I'm a lover of Chinese philosophy and the Indian philosophy and the yoga, then you are outside. Because even majority of the academicians at the university level, in the whole of Europe, in all European countries, the moment is, this is aestheticism, it is romantic movement. So one should be 100 times careful just to go, I want to do Japanese philosophy, I want to do Indian philosophy. That means yoga. And that is nonsense. So do philosophy in the spirit of intercultural philosophy, whether you do it in this country or in Great Britain or in India, in Japan, that doesn't matter. But don't be romantic, that will be difficult. Even if you don't want to be romantic, that is how you would be taken, he's doing. But imagine the moment the students see my face, they say, let us do Indian philosophy. As if I can't teach European philosophy. Whereby my professorship is for European philosophy, not for Indian philosophy. This is the saddest part of this. I won't talk about racism, but that is the trouble. You just imagine. No, then I will take a lot of time. I mean, these are experiences. At the University of Münster, one of the best universities in Germany, and that was 1985. One African student, that is what one of my colleagues told me, African student was doing his doctorate on the philosophy of Kant. You just imagine, the European philosopher, I mean, 6, 7, they were sitting, and one philosopher, Blumenberg, you must have heard his name, one of the best philosophers of Germany, and really a very good thinker. Within this committee, he asked the other colleagues, how can an African understand Kant? You just imagine. This is really sad, but the sad means they have to decide, that is the trouble. But this is a type of how can an African understand Kant. And this is, I praise Kant, but Kant is also in essence racist. Kant says black race is not in a position to think This is what Kant says, you know. So he was not drunk when he said this sentence. So when great philosophers make mistake, then the mistakes are as great, and that is sad. But anyway, let me, yes. Anyway, so intercultural philosophy is not a type of aestheticization. It must not be confused with cultural romanticism and exoticism either. And there is some type of, you are doing Japanese philosophy or Indian philosophy or the Chinese philosophy, and this is some type of romanticism. That is how the romantic movement, particularly in Germany, dealt with the non-European countries. This is why a word of caution is needed here against the long-lived romantic, exotic, and mostly amateurish interest in all that is non-Europeans. It is, you know, that is, we can read in the case of Hegel, you know, exotic is something which we want to be, but we also don't want to be. That is exotic, you know, that it attracts us, but at the same time it dispels us. That is the saddest part of it, you know? And that's why it is always exotic towards Africa, Latin America, this culture and that culture, but at the same time, because this is not the real culture, and this is exotism. And this has been the case for many, many years. In one of my several conversations with the famous German philosopher Gadamer, I was told that Asians, Indians, do not have philosophy in the only genuine Western sense of the term. Their answers, that means the answers of non-European philosophers, their answers are not really answers to the genuine philosophical questions which we put. But Indian philosophy, he added instantly, as if to console me, is full of wisdom, wisheit. You just imagine. But he wanted to console me. Mr. Man, don't worry, you know. You don't have philosophy, but there is wisdom. And this is such a big, of course we may have wisdom, doesn't matter, no, but we have also philosophy the way you have, only in a different way, and so, or epistemologically and all that, but the wisdom, wisdom. This has become a mantra already uttered by the famous Orientalist, Sanskritist and Indologist Sir William Jones in 18th century in India. You just imagine, he was the president of the Bengal Society in Calcutta. Sixth, intercultural philosophy is also not just an offspring of post-modernity, in spite of the fact that postmodern thinking is very conducive and sympathetic to intercultural thinking. 7. Intercultural philosophy is also not a transcultural philosophy, in the sense of an a priori transcendental fixation. The prefix trans claims to be in possession of one universally valid concept of philosophy. That's why transcendental. But this is not the case with the intra or intercultural. Added to this prefix trans is overloaded with ontological, metaphysical, ideological, and theological connotation. Transcendent God. You know, so also transcendent philosophy. That would be 8. To the question whether intercultural philosophy is a new, additional discipline like epistemology and all that, a branch of philosophy, to add the already existing branches of philosophy like ontology, epistemology, ethics, the answer is no. Intercultural philosophy is not a branch of philosophy. It is a methodology. It is an attitude. It is a type of lamp. And with this lamp, you just go do philosophy wherever you do philosophy. And don't allow anybody to absolutize philosophy, whether they are Chinese, Indians, or Africans, or Europeans. That is, and that's why it's like a methodology. It is a way of seeing things and doing things. Now I come to the second step, intercultural philosophy, what it is then. First, In its positive import, intercultural philosophy is the name of a philosophical conviction, attitude, stance, and insight that no philosophy is the philosophy, no culture is the culture. Such an insight accompanies all the different philosophies and cultures and prevents them from absolutizing themselves. That means if you have this intercultural attitude of doing philosophy, then you won't absolutize any one particular gestalt of philosophy. And that's why to philosophize in intercultural spirit means that you always apply this method. Anyway, the second point, intercultural philosophy is constituted by its situated unsituatedness or unsituated situatedness. In my English book, I had a lot of fight with my American colleagues because the German word is really better. Ort hafte Ortlosigkeit. Ort is place, you know. Ort hafte Ortlosigkeit. And that is the word I used in Germany. And when my book was being published in the United States, and they were just wondering, what is this German? You know? And that is situated unsituatedness. That means it is situated somewhere, but it is still not situated anywhere. That was the meaning. In other words, it rightly claims different adjectives, as for example, European, Indian, Chinese, African, Latin American, and so on. It is situated. Philosophy has always a place. It is situated whenever and wherever it takes a particular form. But it is unsituated because it is not fully exhausted in any one particular philosophical tradition. So also in the case of religion, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, there are different forms of religions. So religion is not exhausted in one particular religion. So also philosophy, culture, music, cooking, and whatnot. Anyway, third, intercultural philosophy, thus understood, proceeds methodologically in the following way. It does not unnecessarily give a privileged treatment to any one philosophy, culture, or religion. It also rejects the idea of a mere hierarchical gradation of cultures and philosophy. Such a gradation takes place in the philosophy of Hegel. Such a gradation takes place in the philosophy of Vedanta. And this should be avoided. It takes the idea of cultural plurality very seriously and deems it as a value. Fourth, any study of philosophy from an intercultural perspective situates itself beyond all centrisms, be it Asian, European, Chinese, to name just a few. We should have centers, but we should not be centrists. That we should avoid. Philosophy in cultural comparison subscribes to a hermeneutic model of reciprocity, which does not take the other to be just an echo of oneself. It is no doubt true that in our attempt at understanding others, we cannot fully avoid the hermeneutic circle. That is true. We must, on the other hand, take care not to dogmatize it either. Those who take the hermeneutic circle to be our philosophic fate fail to avoid a repetition of self-understanding in the name of understanding the other. For this reason, intercultural philosophy rejects the idea of a hermeneutics of identity, which is intolerant of difference. That means if you don't understand the world the way I understand, then you understand it wrongly or you don't understand it at all. In our attempt to understand others, there is an encounter in difference. Because if it is identical, there is no need to understand the other. We also experience the other through its resistance to our attempt to assimilate it fully. Fifth, the intercultural hermeneutics we plead for here and which underlies our concept of intercultural philosophy is a non-reductive, open, creative and tolerant hermeneutics. It approves of overlapping centers, searches for them, finds them and cultivates them. These overlapping structures are the common factors which make communication possible and also allow all philosophies and cultures to retain their individual characters. To philosophize, and that is really important for us, to philosophize differently is to philosophize in a different way, to realize philosophy in a different way, and not to philosophize at all. That means if we don't have Hinduism, that is what the Hindu fanatics say, if we don't have Hinduism, we don't have any religion. So also the Christianity, if you don't believe really in Hegel's philosophy, then you believe in some philosophy which are not just on the top. And this won't do. 6. Intercultural philosophical orientation applied to philosophical discourse in world context invites the neglected non-Western philosophical traditions to take an active part in the name of reciprocity. That means the different philosophical traditions should review other traditions from their point of view. 7. Intercultural philosophical orientation stands for a process of emancipation. Emancipation, not understood in the sense of an limited inner European emancipation, but in the sense of an emancipation of non-Western philosophical traditions from the wrong and one-sided pictures of such traditions which originated in Europe. So it has nothing to do with the emancipation in the age of enlightenment. That is, non-European cultures, traditions, philosophies, they want to emancipate themselves from the wrong pictures which Europeans drew of these traditions and cultures. So it is different type of emancipation. 8. Intercultural philosophy introduces thus the idea of a new historiography of philosophy, which bids farewell to the Eurocentric, easy say Hegelian, way of writing books on the history of philosophy. History of philosophy today is not only the history of Western philosophy, but also of all traditions of philosophy. So the moment you read some books, history of Indian philosophy, history of Chinese philosophy, but hardly anybody says history of European philosophy. History of philosophy is just history of European philosophy is history of philosophy as such. The adjective European is omitted. But the moment you talk about China and India, then the adjective is very, very important. 9. Intercultural philosophy pleads for a minimal universality of philosophical rationality across culturally sedimented differences. So there may be one reason, but this reason has different structures in different cultural contexts. In other words, this universality of philosophical rationality shows its presence in different philosophical traditions in the world. It at the same time transcends the specific limits and tradition and binds them together in the sense of a prefix inter. Inter is something in between which joins, and the prefix trans doesn't do it. Its presence is the presence of an in-between, resembling very much the Wittgensteinian concept of family resemblance. There is always some resemblance, but the sister brothers, they are not just identical. So some of the characteristics, face, both the nose and ear, they just resemble. And that's why family resemblance. 10. Intercultural philosophy, true to its interculturally sedimented orientation, fights against the tendency of certain philosophical traditions to put themselves in an absolute universal position. 11. For intercultural philosophy, it is a myth to think of an Europeanization of humanity. This is the phrase used by Husserl. He was dreaming of dreaming of Europeanization of humanity, and he meant really Europeanization of the Greek reason. It is true, there is a global westernization of the world today. You can see in all this technology. But westernization is not necessarily Europeanization. We mistake here the changes in the hardware with the changes in software. I gave you the example, the Japanese culture, for example. The software of the Japanese culture is more or less very, very different from the software of European culture. No? But the hardware is more or less the same. So on the hardware level, it's the same, but the software is more or less completely different. 12. Intercultural philosophical orientation pleads for unity, or yes, but without uniformity. Unity, yes, but uniformity, no. In German, they have a very good two words, Einheit und Einheitlichkeit. Though they should not go together. It is not a matter of a unity in diversity. We have 4 or 5 possibilities. Perhaps when you discuss, then some of the areas make it clearer. It is not a matter of A, unity in diversity, or B, unity and diversity, or C, unity or diversity, or D, neither unity nor diversity, but unity in face of diversity. And you can imagine, I have just done a type of plagiat with Nagarjuna, the 4 types of negations, and the 5th one, unity in face of diversity. So try to find out unity, if possible, in face of diversity. Otherwise, if you say unity in diversity, whose unity? Whose unity in diversity? Hegel's philosophy everywhere, Plato's philosophy everywhere, that only. So that's a unity, and this is the 5th one. You just think about it and help me. 13th, one of the salient features of intercultural philosophy is the cultivation of a foundational insight into some sort of a methodological, epistemological, metaphysical, political, and religious modesty. Interculturality and modesty go together. Modesty of one's approach of one's approach on the way to truth. That means there are different roads to truth, different approaches. And in normal life we understand it. We all want to be happy. But the ways to be happy are very, very different. Sometimes we need money, sometimes we need this, and sometimes we understand these things on the road. But why philosophers has this disease, I fail to understand. You just say intercultural in the department of music, in the department of pedagogy, there are chair holders for intercultural pedagogy in Germany. Many universities, they have these departments. But particularly philosophers are so holy type of people that they say no, philosophy is just singularized and not anything else. Very much in the spirit of an intercultural philosophical orientation, Ganeri speaks of 2 types of orientation. I quote, orientation by means of the pole star. Orientation by means of the pole star, and orientation by means of a compass. The pole star is a fixed point in the distance upon which the traveler, or as here, the inquirer, sets their sights. Orientation by means of compass is quite different, unquote. Different thought patterns, then the different ways of philosophizing, different thought patterns are like a compass. Different ways of philosophizing are like a compass, guiding us with the help of different maxims and principles on our way to the regulative idea as the pole star. That means there is something which we call philosophy, but there are different ways to reach to that pole star. 14. Intercultural philosophical orientation rejects the tendency of giving undue privileged treatment to one's own thought pattern, leading to some sort of an universal claim, as we said, to truth with a capital T. 15. Intercultural philosophy thus leads to an extension of the narrow definition of philosophy towards something that is comprehensive enough to include the richness of philosophical thinking in world context. That means the European definition of philosophy must be extended. This is one thing. And the second thing, which is interesting for you, but is there any one particular definition of European philosophy in Europe? No. That is the problem, you know. There is no European philosophy is a construct. Indian philosophy is also a construct. Plato defines philosophy differently than Aristotle. David Hume defines completely differently than Descartes. So also Schopenhauer and Hegel, of course, they will fight each other to death. You know? So you just imagine, all the time we say European philosophy, as if there is one European philosophy. And there you can say interculturally and intraculturally, they meet here. So these constructs should be avoided. 16. An intercultural philosophical orientation rejects the idea of radical difference and of total identity. These two things should be rejected among different ways of doing philosophy. That means you do philosophy even then when you do philosophy in a completely different way. But you do realize philosophy in another gestalt. Total identity is the dead end of philosophy. Then we are all Hegelian or Buddhist, and that won't do. Then of course there is Atman Brahman and the Nirvana is there or something like that. Total identity is the dead end of philosophy, and total difference lacks even the very minimum of agreement among ways of doing philosophy. This bare common minimum allows us to accept and respect that counter-arguments are arguments after all, in spite of the fact of their being sometimes contrary or even contrary deeply. You know, this I would like to just explain in myself. You know, even if we disagree nearly 99% on some point, and that is shown, that is quite troublesome. But if we accept and respect each other and say, you also argue, and I also argue. That means counter-arguments are arguments after all. Maybe they are contrary. And this is what I normally tell the students. Hegel and Schopenhauer, they both philosophize. Even though in reality they say, no, Hegel is no philosopher. And Schopenhauer, when Schopenhauer would say, Hegel is no philosopher, Hegel would say, no, Schopenhauer is not a philosopher. So this should be given up. To philosophize in a different way is to philosophize. That means counter-arguments are arguments. Otherwise you can't say, if Plato is a philosopher, what is about Aristotle? He differs. And that is my point, which I wanted to emphasize. 17. Since intercultural philosophical orientation does not fix the standard of comparison, the one tertium comparationis solely in one particular tradition, it provides us with the very prerequisites of doing philosophy, of doing comparative philosophy. There has been a constant dissatisfaction with the discipline of comparative philosophy in the past. because it implicitly or explicitly started with a prefixed definition of philosophy, which led to a different form of centrism. Eurocentrism is the result not only of the deep-rooted conviction of philosophy being solely Western, it is also the result of the historical contingency, as I told, in combination with colonialism and imperialism. To use an often used metaphor, comparative philosophy is blind without intercultural philosophy, and intercultural philosophy is lame without comparative philosophy. You know, one example I normally use in my lectures in Germany, Hegel read Indian philosophy, and Hegel has talked about non-European philosophies in his system, and that is something very good. But the trouble is, Hegel compares all the different philosophies, but before he compares, he knows what philosophy is. That means the tertium comparationis is already fixed. Before he compares, he knows. And that is what happened to the missionaries in both Americas, in India. They just compared, but they knew the real religion is Christianity. But still they compare. So if you know what philosophy ultimately is, then it makes no sense that you compare. And that means a priori transcendental fixation of tertium comparationis won't help. And that is one of the reasons why comparative religious departments, they have never succeeded really, because it was ultimately one particular religion. Ninth, intercultural philosophical orientation is quite critical of the undue importance added to the so-called linguistic argument in fixing the nature of philosophy. Philosophy has no single mother tongue, be it Greek, German, Sanskrit, or Chinese. It is true that language structures do influence our way of doing philosophy, but they do not fix it completely. Heraclitus and Parmenides did two very different types of philosophy in one and the same language, and that is Greek language. It was their mother tongue, but the moment they started talking about things in philosophy, they were talking two different things. Mutatis mutandis, the same applies in case of Buddhist and Hindu philosophies. Both read Sanskrit, both interpreted the Vedic tradition in India, but very, very differently. Lao Tzu and Confucius, the same thing. Schopenhauer and Hegel in Germany. It is not the case that we who speak a language belong to this language. It is rather the other way around. It is that the language we speak belong to us. We don't belong to language. It is the other way around. Otherwise, I can't talk English here. Otherwise, it will be difficult. But the moment, because language structure determines our way of thinking, but it does not fix it. Otherwise you can't write literature in different languages. It will be very, very difficult. 20. Intercultural philosophical orientation leads us to develop a badly needed philosophical competence, which enables us to realize that to do philosophy in a different way is indeed to do philosophy in a different way, as we said. 21. There is a widespread, though unfounded, fear among certain philosophical circles that philosophy hereby, that means in the spirit of intercultural philosophy, that philosophy hereby loses its identity, is deconstructed and becomes fully relativist. But the fact is that the deconstructivist aspect of this new orientation of intercultural philosophy does not relativize the universal applicability as such, but only the absolute use, claim made of this term by certain philosophical traditions, which define philosophy and their tradition reciprocally. You know, there are cultures, you know, if you define your tradition with the help of truth, and truth with the help of your tradition, there is no magic there. You know? And that happens sometimes. Truth and tradition, they define each other. And then of course no other tradition can define truth, because truth definition, this definition has exhausted the content of truth. Indian philosophy, for example, is philosophy, and here it overlaps with other philosophical traditions. But it is also Indian, and here it is different and shows its cultural embeddedness. This is true not only inter but also interculturally. The adjectival differences are illuminating. They may be complementary, but they never deny or even undermine the universal unity of philosophical thinking. That means plurality of philosophical thinking is still philosophical thinking. 22, and the last. Intercultural philosophy thus stands for a process of emancipation from all types of centrisms, whether European or non-European. So centrism should be avoided, whether it is European or non-European. Only non-European centrism has never made a history up till today. Intercultural philosophy allows for preferential and differentiating treatment of philosophical traditions, but it is not discriminatory and monolithic. That is, it rather enables us to critically and sympathetically view the one philosophical tradition from the viewpoint of the other and the other way around. Here I leave 1 or 2 points. Now let us come to another topic. It was the concept of an interculturally oriented, fourfold, analogous hermeneutics. The way in which the continents address each other today is of a different quality and takes place in a philosophical, religious, cultural, and political atmosphere of an inevitable reciprocity. This de facto hermeneutic situation, this defective hermeneutic situation is, say, this situation in which we are here. It is a hermeneutic situation where different philosophical traditions, across the countries meet to differ and differ to meet. This de facto hermeneutic situation is characterized by the fact that for the last few decades, particularly in the age of post-colonialism, for the last few decades, non-Europeans also think and write about Europe. That is something new. Non-Europeans write books on Kant and Hegel. And that is something new for European thinkers. They write books on Europe, explain it, and make judgments about it. This has hardly been the case since the invasion of Alexander the Great in India and the discovery of America through Columbus. Later on, the other cultures have got a tongue and they talk. They talk not only about themselves, but they also talk about the Europeans. You just go to the African philosopher, they will tell you a long story. That is not what you, all the time you talked about us, but you never talked about us. So the whole thing is the other way around, that Europeans tell us, Africans tell us what African identity is. And this is something which is new. This has hardly been the case, as I told you. This new hermeneutic situation further bears the level of a fourfold hermeneutics dialectic. That is what I wanted to say. First of all, this fourfold, first of all, there is the way European understands themselves. This is self-hermeneutics of Europeans. Secondly, there is the European understanding of the non-Europeans. That is the hermeneutics of the others from the European side. Thirdly, there is the way non-Europeans understand themselves, a self-hermeneutic of the non-Europeans. And fourthly, the way they, non-Europeans, themselves draw a picture of Europeans, just the other way around. The table is turned. The fact that Europe itself is now an object of interpretation, that is something Western consciousness has a lot of trouble at present. They simply wonder that non-Europeans try to understand us. But that is none of their business in the history of philosophy. The fact that Europe is itself is now an object of interpretation is quite new, astonishing, primarily for the European mind. Non-Europeans don't wonder, they are happy in it. But Europeans just wonder how come that they dare write books on Kant and Hegel. This is because we could write on it and did. The phenomenon of understanding is a very complex process indeed, be it self-understanding or understanding of the other. Sometimes there is a lot of misunderstanding with ourselves. As Goethe says, there are two pieces in us. It is a very self-complacent move to believe that one's understanding of the other is better than his or her understanding herself. Nearly all the different branches of Orientalism and ethnology, at least in the past, have followed such a thinking, such a line of one-sided thinking. With intercultural understanding as a goal, we cannot just insist on deciding problems of mutual understanding regarding the truth and falsity of a definite culture, religion, or philosophy in a metaphysical vein before undertaking steps at concrete mutual understanding. Any a priori metaphysical or ideological decision precludes the possibility of a genuine understanding. Sometimes you say, that is what when missionaries went to Africa or America, both America, they said, we can't understand these red Indians. We can't understand Africans. And my suggestion is, first you try to understand. And if you fail to understand, then tell me, I don't understand you. But in the sense of an a priori decision, no, we can never understand these blacks. Or we can never understand this culture. This is what normally happened, that before trying to understand, one already decided it's impossible to understand. That's why they never undertook they didn't try to understand. Today we have to take into account that there is a double perspective that a philosopher, theologian, and ethnologist can take, which means he or she can turn to himself or herself and make their own culture as an object of study, self-critical. It is better to be diffident in one's truth claim. The philosophers may discuss the question of true knowledge in the best epistemological way, but ultimately it comes to our preference for a particular set of arguments. That is what we discussed yesterday. When we have read Kant and Hegel and all these things, then ultimately, all of a sudden it happens to you, oh yeah, Kant is nearer to me. And there is no deductive logic for this, because the same arguments impress you, not me, and the other way around. And that is where philosophy is also a matter of taste. It is not only a matter of logos, or it is not only a matter of reason, of course it is, but ultimately it is also a matter of taste, or inclination, or philosophical disposition, which you bring with yourself. All discourses deal with arguments for and against these preferences, that you can see in the political parties, that you are a member of this party or that party. Only we should never be a member of a party which doesn't accept any political party. And that is the trouble with political parties, whether they are rightist or leftist. That doesn't matter. We expect all cultures to argue and let argue. That is the main thing. This is what an epistemologically oriented hermeneutics aims at. Those who talk about the radical other claim the truth for themselves and underrate the importance and virtue of relativism and pluralism. The foreignness of the other is a phenomenon we are confronted with even in our own home cultures. Within the same culture, there is foreignness. The question of making sense of a foreign culture possesses a constitutive reciprocity. There is a generic similarity between intra and intercultural understanding and misunderstanding. Philosophical misunderstandings may be intercultural, but also intracultural. Within the same philosophical tradition, we misunderstand each other, or we interpret each other. The alien, the alien, the other is given to us before our attempt at understanding the other. A hermeneutics which reduces and absorbs the other destroys the spirit of interculturality. In our search for an adequate hermeneutics of intercultural philosophy, there is only one hermeneutics which does justice to an understanding of the other. This hermeneutics we term here an interculturally oriented analogous hermeneutics, meaning thereby that where there is an inaccessibility of the other as regards contents, all that we can rely upon are the analogous structural patterns which make understanding possible beyond all centuries. Analogous hermeneutic does not demand identity of views for understanding. The meeting of different cultures, philosophies and religions, which we have not so much aspired to, but which has rather happened to us in the wake of modernity with all its global technological traditions, they call for an intensive and reciprocal dialogue on the part of all concerned. The general concept of philosophy does possess a universal connotation over and above its particularity. I leave a few lines. Philosophy is one of the most refined products of human mind and culture. Since the idea of a totally pure culture is a fiction, a myth rather, there is hardly any philosophy which can claim to be fully free from influences. This means that different cultures and philosophies influence each other and still keep their idiosyncratic features, which enables us to apply different adjectives to the nouns philosophy and culture. One may even go further and maintain some sort of a tautology in the phrase intercultural philosophy, as we already mentioned. Philosophy is a general concept with its individual instances. In order to know wherein the overlapping general character lies, let us put the question, and this is analytically logical and at the same time interculturally interesting. Under what conditions are we entitled to say that two things A and B are first just different and second radically different? If two things, say two cultures or philosophies, are just different, it means that there are two different instances, examples of the general concept philosophy. In case we take them to be radically different, we are not entitled to use the same general concept for both of them, for they are different as cultures and philosophy. In such a case, we cannot even articulate this radical difference, but the very general concept loses its applicability. Thus, the concept of culture and philosophy with which we are obliged to operate must be of an analogous character. No culture, whether it is Chinese, European, Indian, or any other, is a monolithic and monadic culture. Any attempt to examine cultures as closed systems is philosophically and methodologically unsound and politically even dangerous, because it may lead to the ideology of culturalism, which ascribes to certain cultures absolute values and treats the others as means to an end. Even if there is one truth with a capital T, no philosophy, no culture, no religion, and no political thought can claim to possess it exclusively and all alone. We may trace back the origin of culture and philosophy even deeper in the past, till the continuous thread loses its prints in the abysmal depth of the past. We generally speak of the three birthplaces of philosophy: China, India, and Greece. Jasper's well-known axle hypothesis leads to such a view. Clearly, there are other traditions of philosophy in other parts of the world, including Latin America and Africa. Philosophy, that is the activity we engage in when we do philosophy, is first a cross-cultural, universal, and then only Greek, Indian, Chinese, African, and so on, and not the other way around. I have always wondered how the Greco-Eurocentric concept of philosophy succeeded in exclusively absolutizing itself and came to the conclusion that the major factors of an extra-philosophical nature, we already said colonial and all that. It goes to the credit of modern Europe, its sciences and technology, that we have cultural encounters in a global context today. I would have never been here without this technology of European culture. The universal bent of European mind, seems to be partly disillusioned because it is forced to realize that the days are gone when Europe alone was destined to make and influence history. European history is one of the histories in the histories of the world, and this was not the case a few centuries ago. This goes to define the present world context, which in its turn contextualizes globally important things like culture, philosophy, religion, ethics, art, literature, politics, even ecology. The demand for universal validity and acceptance turns out to be paradoxical, and the need for a binding pluralism becomes incumbent upon us. Transculturality of the conceptual and categorical apparatus of the natural and formal sciences is of course different from the normative demand put on the attitude of interculturality in the field of humanities. You know, if two mathematicians or physicists from India or China and Europe, they meet with each other, they just understand each other. But the moment a politician, religion, philosophy, music, and other forms of culture, they meet, then of course the difference starts. Because the analytical side is not that clear in that case. The general term philosophy possesses both cultural and cross-cultural aspects. The very phrase European philosophy, for example, testifies to this fact, for it underlies the universal applicability of the general term philosophy, along with its legitimate use of the adjective European. The same analysis applies to other phrases like Chinese, Indian, and other philosophy. To the question whether intercultural philosophy is a new additional discipline, we already said the answer is no. Intercultural philosophy, as mentioned above, is first and foremost the name of a philosophical attitude or a philosophical instance. We don't have to repeat it. Then I just skip over a bit. The globally present intercultural context today has made one thing abundantly clear. The de facto intercultural hermeneutic situation has outgrown the Greco-European and Judeo-Christian interpretation of culture, philosophy, and religion. European culture is one of the cultures in the world of all cultures. it calls for a deconstruction of an exclusive relation between truth and tradition. Truth of the tradition and truth in the tradition are two different things and must not be confused with one another. That means sometimes European philosophy or European culture, if you define truth with the help of your culture and define culture with the help of the truth, this is a tautology and nobody can get out of it. So the truth in one tradition is not necessarily to define this with the same form. Fourfold dimensions of intercultural philosophy. Yesterday, some of you were interested in the political side of intercultural philosophy, and these four sides are philosophical, religious, political, and pedagogical. Intercultural philosophy, as we understand it here, has a fourfold perspective: philosophical, religious, political, and pedagogical. The phenomenon of interculturality under philosophical optics means that the one philosophia perennis is no one's possession all alone. It is a prejudice to think that philosophy has a preference for a special language, tradition, or culture, that we have already said. Karl Löwit, commenting on Heidegger, says that Heidegger really believed that being favors two languages, Greek and German, and shows a special liking for the European tradition. So no religion should absolutize itself. Under the religious theological perspective, interculturality is the name of interreligiosity, with the firm conviction that the one religio perennis, Hindus call it Sanatan Dharma, is also no one's possession all alone. The Indian poet-philosopher, I just quote, the Indian poet-philosopher Tagore writes, I quote, "If humanity ever happens to be overwhelmed with the universal flood of a bigoted exclusiveness, then God will have to make provision for another Noah's Ark to save his creature from the catastrophe of his spiritual dissolution." He uses a very powerful context from the Bible. It's a prejudice to think that philosophy has a preference for any of these systems. This religious, the highest religious truth is in need of expression, but it also resists total expressibility. Under the political optics, interculturality is another name for a pluralistic, democratic attitude with the conviction that political wisdom does not belong to any one particular group, party, or ideology. All philosophies of history, with the absolutistic claim of possessing the only true real message, are politically fundamentalist and practically dangerous. The pedagogical perspective is the most important one, for it prepares the way for the practical implementation of the other three dimensions. To teach philosophy in an intercultural philosophical orientation is primarily a methodological step. This means that every teacher of philosophy, particularly in the field of the history of philosophy, is committed to inform students, for example, in their lectures and seminars on epistemology, that besides the two main means of knowledge in Occidental philosophy, e.g. senses and reason, there are 6 means of knowledge, e.g. in Indian epistemology. The philosophy teachers should be primarily interested in informing the students and only secondarily interested in making judgments about the truth and falsity of the epistemological tradition. You may be a Christian or Hindu, but don't say the other religion, there is no religion at all. This means an overall change of the philosophy curriculum in Western universities, but also in the universities of countries which are still overloaded with the European themes. Towards the conception of interculturally oriented historiography of philosophy, I'll take some 10 minutes. No, I'm not tired, so, but I want to discuss with you later. But then let us see, please. We are coming to an end. Towards the conception of an interculturally oriented historiography of philosophy. Nearly all books on the history of philosophy in the Occidental Hemisphere are in fact histories of Western philosophy. Bertrand Russell is a rare exception because he entitles his book History of Western Philosophy. He uses the adjective Western. The idea behind this age-old academic practice is this: all adjectival qualifications are limiting concepts except the adjective European or Western, which is as if by nature universal in its import. I mean, the adjective European has universalized itself, as we told, because of political and imperial and other factors, colonial factors. We have already noted that the self-universalization of the adjective Western is a historical contingency supported and enforced by colonial, cultural, imperialist, and even racist forces. The famous Latin American philosopher Leopoldo Sea speaks of a, that is his expression, magisterial reason, which only Greeks possess, in opposition to the barbarians who just stutter and nobody understands. Sea rightly comments, for the barbarians, he says, the Greeks were stutterers. For the barbarians, the Greeks were stuttering, because the barbarians couldn't understand the Greeks, but the Greeks were more powerful, and that's why they defined the whole history in their fashion. The colonial reason seems to possess a long history. Even the idea of the reason of the mainstream forefathers of European Enlightenment is far too Eurocentric and even racist. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, edited by Garfield and William Engelhardt, there I just want to quote for you two sentences. In today's multicultural world, the neglect of non-Western thought constitutes a kind of neo-colonialism, legitimizing violence by suppressing the perspective of others, which is morally unacceptable. So it is not only philosophically, epistemologically, but it is morally unacceptable not to teach other ways of thinking or doing things. And this is something very clear here. There is no one history, no one philosophy for all of us. It is true across cultures. I once experimented, and this really I did in one of the seminars in Germany. I once experimented with the idea in one of my philosophy seminars at the University of Munich in Germany, and asked 4 students to write a paper on Kant using 4 books on the history of philosophy. Because normally the student, but who understands Kant really? How do I know that? I can just tell you different interpretations of Kant, and I can say this is my preference. But to say no, this is the only Kant, who knows that? That is what I tried once. Anyway, So here, 4 students to write a paper on Kant, seminar paper, using 4 books on the history of philosophy. Bertrand Russell, Windelband, Copleston, and a book published by Soviet Academy. These 4 books on history of Western philosophy. The 4 students came out with 4 Kants and were wondering about which Kant is the real Kant. That was the question. They did not ask the question whether there is one Kant for all the readers of Kant. It is here that a teacher of philosophy should inform the students that there is a relativity of viewpoints, relativity of interpretation. We are condemned to have perspectives. The view from nowhere is really nowhere. Because the moment you say the view from nowhere is Christianity, or is this ideology or that ideology, that won't do. It is true there may be one Kant before our interpretation as a bare referent, but different ways of interpreting Kant result in different Kants. In other words, virginity of meaning. Virginity of meaning is no doubt virgin, but only before and not after the interpretation. One is reminded here of the biblical story of the fall of man. We are all realists and constructivists in one, because we cannot create ex nihilo. It is only the privilege of God to create ex nihilo. But we human beings have to have something to interpret, no? Or to make something out of something else. And that's why we are both in one. We are constructivists and realists at the same time. We can't do magic. The teaching of philosophy in an intercultural spirit would also mean that students learn that philosophical arguments, though always needed, are not by nature universally convincing. They are only necessary but not sufficient condition for conviction. Whoever defines philosophical arguments to be genuinely philosophical only when they are convincing would find themselves in a very awkward situation not to find any philosophical argument universally convincing to debate. What we need today is a pluralistic mapping of histories of philosophy. Even the all too often mentioned dictum that philosophy is philosophy only within a written tradition is far too logocentric. Traditions which are not written traditions, they may have, and they have philosophy. If you talk to Africans in the bush, what is justice, they will tell you. What is humanity, they will tell you in their own way. And this one should accept. Logocentrism is one way. According to Mircea Eliade, Western philosophy cannot move within its own tradition without becoming provincial. That is the quotation, And this happens to all the traditions. These words of Eliade apply mutatis mutandis to all cultures, philosophies, and religions in the global context today more than ever. The globally present intercultural context today has made one thing abundantly clear. The de facto intercultural hermeneutic situation has outgrown the Greco-European and Judaic-Christian interpretation of culture, philosophy, and religion. It calls for a deconstruction of an exclusive relation between truth and tradition. Truth of the tradition and truth in the tradition are two different things and must not be confused with one another. Alternatives are alternatives, and they must not be recognized and respected. They must be recognized and respected as such. Of course, alternatives lose their open and tolerant character when they put themselves in an absolute position. It is somewhat a philosophical joke that a plurality of absolutes relativizes itself. relativism absolutized becomes absolutism. Greek philosophy is the only philosophy. The adjective Greek has absolutized itself. The theory and practice of an interculturally oriented historiography of philosophy is not against the European historiographical models, not. It only denies their centrism and provincialism, which have universalized themselves. Added to this, the history of the European historiography of philosophy can only be narrated in the Eurocentric European way. This, of course, would apply to any form of universalized provincialism. It's a contradiction, but this is what really happened. The Eurocentric historiography of philosophy has long, in fact far too long, cultivated the fiction of there being only one birthplace of philosophy, Greece. Such great philosophers like Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, Adhar believe in such a singular universality. The dichotomy between Occidental and Oriental ways of thinking is simply a corollary of this movement. In the spirit of an interculturally oriented historiography of philosophy, all philosophy departments all over the world are duty-bound to teach philosophy beyond the limits of European philosophy. Even the problem of doing and teaching philosophy needs a pluralistic methodological move. Philosophy has never been monolithic in its methodology. This is true in spite of the monolithic and absolutist claim of certain philosophical systems and schools all over the world. Our intercultural philosophical orientation seems to inaugurate some sort of a Copernican revolution in an interculturally oriented historiography of philosophy. For a very long time, it was European philosophy which somehow managed to be in the center as the one philosophy's son, as the one son of philosophy, and all other philosophies like planets were rotating around this one son of European philosophy. But now the perennial son of one philosophy, at least as a regulative idea, stands in the center, and all philosophies, whether European or non-European, rotate around the one son of philosophy. So there is one son of philosophy in the center, and European philosophy and all other philosophies, they are just the different, they just rotate around the one son of philosophy. It is a model of inclusion, not exclusion. Truth with a capital T is nobody's possession all alone. There are different terms normally used to describe this situation: decolonization, deconstruction, interculturalization, and deconceptualization. One of the devastating side effects of the long period of colonization was, and in certain senses it is, that it gave birth to the fiction philosophy is white. You know that philosophy is white. I mean, even today, Ganelli says that majority of the philosophy departments in Western countries are white philosophy departments. Our intellectual philosophical orientation ascribes no one particular color or language to philosophy. Philosophy is colorless, not in the sense that philosophy is colorless. Philosophy colors in the sense it is not the property of one particular race. It is not only the Indian caste system with its 4 colors which is discriminatory, but even philosophers like Kant talk of 4 colors: red, those were the red Indians, red, black, yellow, and white. Which white? White of course being the best in nearly all fields. And this is what in Germany at present there are some persons who are very well aware of Kant, and they say Kant was a racist. And he really says, blacks can't think. That is the trouble. And so also in many cases, in case of Hegel, the same thing. Recently, the protests by students at the prestigious School of Oriental and African Studies in Oxford demanding, and these students demand that white philosophers be dropped from the curriculum is a case in point. I mean, they go too far. But a word of caution is needed here. We must refrain from throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There is a long protest for the last so many months in Oxford and London. They want that Kant and Hegel should be dropped out. I mean, that is too much, So we should not go too far, And that is a reaction which I personally won't accept, that won't do. Intercultural philosophy is not something marginal to philosophy. It is rather a hardcore philosophy. It is really sad that intercultural philosophy is sometimes mistakenly viewed as engaging in non-European philosophy. So since you are going to shape the future of philosophy or intercultural philosophy, be careful just to be careful, because all of a sudden you say, oh, I'm doing intercultural philosophy, they will just, oh, you are busy with non-European philosophy. And this is really sad. And that is what I have been fighting with this prejudgment. And in my case, because of the color also, But it may happen even to you if you say intercultural, oh, you are busy with non-European philosophy. And that is not the case. I simply don't accept if an Indian philosopher says the real Pandits of philosophy sit in Varanasi. No, they don't do. They sit everywhere and nowhere, where it is, which country it may be. It's really sad that intercultural philosophy is sometimes mistakenly viewed as engaging in non-European philosophy. Intercultural philosophy is not a fringe phenomenon. It is some sort of a well-fraught perspective when philosophy is exclusively equated with European philosophy. This well-fraught perspective of Chuang Tzu. He just said that there was a frog in the well, Chuang Tzu. And this frog just said, the whole sky is that big as I see. And this is the whole of it. And that is just called well-fraught perspective. In Sanskrit also, there is a view, Hoop Manduk. Hoop is the well, and the Manduk is the frog. And then I just skip over a few parts. In the very well-argued and forward-looking book entitled Comparative Philosophy Without Borders, Chakrabarty and Weber speak of 3 stages of comparative philosophy. The third state, which they prefer, is termed as fusion philosophy. With an open eye, leaving behind all separating borders. In full agreement with this intention of the two authors, I would like to remind you that the famous and very influential German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer also used a similar term, and this is fusion of horizon. The German word is Horizont Verschmelzung, but meaning thereby not an open-ended conversation of different philosophical traditions, Eastern and Western, but a fusion under the umbrella of Western philosophy. And that is, and there one must be very, very careful, because this Horizont Verschmelzung, fusion philosophy, is a very powerful term, just first used by Gadamer. Gadamer's fusion of horizon, Horizont Verschmelzung, stands not for a horizon fusion of different philosophical traditions all over the world. It rather aims at a vertical fusion under the Western philosophical tradition as the only tradition This is Hegel in disguise. Now just 2 minutes, some of the formulations, how should we move them? My formulation of a few imperatives for learning, doing and teaching philosophy in the spirit of an intercultural philosophical orientation. So these imperatives, I ask you to take it in a very humble spirit, but that is how I would like that we should move. First, remember that no philosophy, whether intra or interculturally, whether Eastern or Western, is the philosophy. This is one imperative. The view, as we said, the view from nowhere is really nowhere. Second, avoid all temptations and fixation of tertium comparationis in any particular philosophical tradition, whether Occidental or Oriental. Third, refrain from the claim to be in sole possession of the original virgin meaning of a text. The text as one has a meaning, but don't claim your interpretation of the meaning is the only interpretation of meaning. Fourth, differentiate between uniqueness and absoluteness. Your position may be unique, but it need not be absolute. Tastes are sometimes unique, but these tastes should not be absolutized. I gave you the example Caviar and spinach yesterday. Fifth, remember that to philosophize differently, as we said, is to do and realize philosophy differently. This is a basic asymmetry. There is a basic asymmetry between question and answers, problems and solutions. Solutions, of course, lagging behind the problems. There is an asymmetry. Problems are more than solutions. Six, take it as a motto, the real question is not how to get rid of differences, but how to deal with them. Believe me, I mean, that is what I have been experiencing for all these years. The moment you want to get rid of all the differences, then you must become a dictator or God knows what. So the best way is not to try to get rid of all differences, but try to find out how to deal with differences. And this happens even interpersonally. With your friend, wife, husband, or two nations or countries, there are differences, so try to manage. And that is where one should try to find like overlaps, that you can somehow communicate. 7, recognize and respect different ways of, say, reading a text or a tradition, except a reading which does not recognize any other reading. You know, I won't be able to read all these things. In one of the seminars, I just talked with the students, tolerate only the tolerant. Some of the students were so angry with me. Tolerate only the tolerant. You said, no, that is impossible. When you tolerate them, tolerate everybody. I said, no. Intolerance kills my intolerance. And that's why it is a tolerance. Tolerance is a value. And this value means that different ways should be allowed. So tolerate only the tolerant. And this is politically also true. If one politically, if the Communist Party says, no, this is the only true party, what should I do with this party? You know? So the Communist Party is one of the parties in the democracy of parties. That's all right. But that is what they don't accept. Whether it is Hitler or Stalin, that is what they don't do. To tolerate only the tolerant. So it is not because I don't like the nose or the color of the intolerant person. No, the intolerant person kills a virtue for which tolerance stands. I plead for different views, and your view is the only view you tell me. What should I do with such a view? That's why tolerate only the tolerance. Tolerant. Yes. Anyway, 8. Remember that all philosophical, religious, political, and other arguments may be contrary, or at times even contradictory. But arguments, as we already said, arguments are arguments after all. This is where difference not only joins us, but also obligatory and binding. That the difference is joins us, it is obligatory and binding. That is the ethical, the moral aspect of this phase. 9. Remember, the logic of total identity is far too essentialistic, and the logic of radical difference is far too relativistic. The golden mean between these two opposing positions is a balanced logic of overlap, which recognizes basic similarities and illuminating differences, enabling us to philosophize and let philosophize. So believe and let believe, read and let read. You know? And if it pains you, if others read in a different way, then try to undergo this pain. That will be the only way out. 10. Remember that Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy are in fact high-level intellectual constructs. Any rigid, radical distinction between modes of thinking and a linear philosophical development culminating in one philosophical system, such as Hegel's system or Advaita Vedanta or Husserl's phenomenology, is ridiculous. That won't do. In spirit of our intercultural philosophical conviction, I want to end my lecture quoting with total approval and appreciation the words of Ganeri in the service of the goals of academic philosophy in interculturally oriented world philosophical context. This is the central idea of his promising model, you know that, for a re-emergent philosophy. That is the word he uses, re-emergent philosophy. Ganeri writes, the world of academic philosophy is now entering a new age, one defined neither by colonial need for recognition, nor for the post-colonial wish to integrate. And intercultural philosophy aims at such a view and change. Last sentence, my dream is hopefully not too utopian to philosophize in the spirit of intercultural philosophical orientation in such a way that the ladder of intercultural philosophy is no more needed because we philosophize intercultural. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your lecture. So, if anyone has any questions now or would like to make a comment. Yes, Carlos?
I'll try to be quick, but there's something that I've often heard this in some occasions when this is argued, when the topic of intercultural philosophy is enlarging the notion of philosophy emerges. Then some people say, well, what are we going to do with the canon? Because now if we enlarge the definition of philosophy, then we won't know anymore what students should read and what is more important to read. And, well, it is a serious worry in several departments, I would guess. And I know of an association called Against Professional Philosophy. Well, that's another matter. That's a provocative name. That's the United States style anyway. Mm. But they claim for something interesting. They say the answer to this, to the problem of the canon, is no canon. So their idea is, instead of a canon of what should be read or what is more important to read, what we should do is to first allow students to have all the information and get them the access to the information and let them choose their own path. Get them some freedom for that. What do you think about it?
Yes, I mean that is, I just told you the first duty of the teacher of philosophy is to inform and not tell the students this is the real card. I mean, I would agree with it. Only if the definitions of philosophy, their number become too big or too much. That was the criticism of work. If we define philosophy in 100 ways, what should the students do? That is the problem or what?
The problem some people argue is if we enlarge the philosophy to include other traditions, then we wouldn't know anymore which texts are should be part of the canon, which texts should be compulsory in
the curriculum.
To the ones
yes,
in the curriculum, in opposition to the ones that are just optional.
Yes, but there in the globalized world today, we have to take into account the other, say, epistemological models. So if Western university decide we just teach our philosophy, then of course they can do it, and they do it even today. Only this argument won't work if they want to discuss with other cultures. You know, at present, economically, in the field of economics, Europe is accepting China. The day may come when Europe really accepts other cultures also think. We have Europe, you just see the one-eyed nature of European thinking. Europeans always thought democracy and the freedom of, say, economic freedom, they go together. China is one of the best experiments to have a communist government with a capitalistic system and with such a success. And that is Eurocentrism. You know, I am not for the system, but Europe always thought democracy and this type of democracy always goes with liberal positions in economics. And that is what China is not doing, and with success. So such centrisms should be given up. And your question, I understand, what should the students then read? Of course, there we have to limit the numbers. No? But to limit the numbers doesn't mean limit the numbers only within Europe. That is what I mean. It should be, it is my duty as a teacher to tell the students there are systems of epistemology or even, say, logic in India, or systems in China. So this information is needed. You know? Otherwise, the students are also being informed in so many different fields. No, only I accept it, but why do you leave me alone outside? That is the trouble.
Anyone else would like to make a comment, make a question? Yes?
Eu vou falar em português porque eu gosto muito do sotaque do Lucas.
He said he's going to speak in Portuguese because he likes my accent very much. Yes, but apparently he likes my accent very much and he wants to hear me translate.
Oh.
Entre tantas coisas interessantes que o professor falou, mencionou aspecto que a filosofia intercultural não deveria ser ramo. Não deveria ser somente ramo numa formação filosófica. É fascinante. Mas ele acha válido que, por exemplo, se abra uma cadeira de uma cátedra de filosofia indiana, num curso de filosofia estruturada da maneira europeia. Ele acha que isso tem algum valor ou não é?
So what he asked is that he finds one of the ideas he liked the most about what you said was this idea that intercultural philosophy isn't a new branch of philosophy or a branch such as epistemology, metaphysics, and so on. But then he asked if you, with that in mind, if you still think that a chair on Indian philosophy, for instance, in a university or something to that effect, would still have some interest, if that could be something positive in any way. Or what would you think? What would you think about that?
I'm completely positive about it. That is because in European university in Germany, for example, there is here for Hegelianism or Platonism, medieval philosophy. That will be one way to introduce non-European philosophy with such positions in the university level. Only they should be within the philosophy department. In the whole of Germany, there is not a single university where Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy is taught. It is a part of the language department, and that's why once when we were talking with Lucas, in Germany, then suppose you want to do Nagarjuna, then German philosophers would send you to the Indology department. Then I asked the students, if I want to do Kant or Hegel, should I go to the German department? But it's the same logic. It's the same logic. But colonialism and all these things, it has become a structure, And then, of course, the philosophers came to that, and they said, no, philosophy is European, and that's why no Indian philosophy. And this one, that would be all right, chair for Chinese philosophy, or she is in the chair of epistemology. All the epistemology, so far as possible, should be taught. But that would be one thing, and that would be all right. Yes.
Anyone else? Yes, please. So, first of all, she said she liked your lecture very much, and that was lovely. But then she asked, in this not only Eurocentric but also patriarchal society of ours, she thought it's worth mentioning that that apparently not a woman was mentioned in the text. And the question is, what would be the role of thinking about, what would be the role of woman in thinking about intercultural philosophy in that sense, if that would have any place in this discussion?
Yeah. That is, unfortunately, not that I didn't want such things to do. First, I am not well informed, and there were some very powerful women, what is this?
This is a person.
Oh yeah, I press it here. There are some very powerful women thinkers, even in the past, But, I come from India, that the trouble is the whole history, not only the history of philosophy, was against women. Very great philosophers. You just imagine Kant or Hegel, they believe that women can't think. You just imagine Husserl, on which I work. Husserl at the University of Göttingen, Jew lady, a mathematician and philosopher, she wanted to do her habilitation under Husserl. And Husserl said, no, it is impossible, you can't do that. No? That women, and knowing so much of mathematics. The same lady is one of the best mathematicians today, was in the States. So, of course, this is what you say, I would, of course, prefer it, and the majority is neglected, But the trouble is in all tradition, even in India, India is not in the, Indians are in a way horrible in relation to the treatment of women. That is, Devi and Dasi. That these are two words. Devi, women are Devi, goddess, and Dasi, they are just the servants. So Indians have their own way of treating this problem. So we have goddesses, my goddess, and on the other hand, the way they treat the women. So this has become such a tradition. The trouble is that very great thinkers, they gave a very wrong, bad picture. And this has become a tradition. Take the case of Schopenhauer, a great thinker, or Nietzsche, of course, leave it. So I would, of course, pray for it, that such things happen. Of course, I could have mentioned one or two Gargi in one of the Upanishads. You know, that Gargi and his husband, who is a philosopher, and Gargi's questions are being answered by the philosopher, and Gargi is one of the best philosophers, women philosophers in Indian tradition. You know? I mean, I'm happy that you told me, Mr. Mal, you should think that way too. Thank you. You know, I should have mentioned some big names. Only the world tradition is really anti. You know?
Anyone else would like? Yes, please.
Exemplo de autor que consegue fazer filosofia melhor, ou seja, que sai desse lugar nenhum. Tem exemplo de texto de autor que faça essa filosofia.
He asked if you have an example of some author who does philosophy interculturally in that sense that you explained. Someone who has written a text or a book or a work in which he does philosophy interculturally in that sense. Other than you, of course, I'm assuming. in this, with this idea of the view of not being situated in any specific place.
No, there are some, you know, particularly in Western countries, say, I mean, I founded this intercultural society some years ago. The University of Vienna. Vienna University is the only university in the whole of Europe, and there is a chair, and I'm so happy, there is a chair for intercultural philosophy in Vienna. And one of my friends, he is now the president, I was for the last 14 years, he is the president, Professor Stenger, and he has this chair. Such a small country, and Vienna has a chair for intercultural philosophy. It will take, of course, a long time. Yeah? But things are changing a bit. And then, of course, in Vienna, my colleague Wimmer and Stenger, and there are one or two students of mine who are professors themselves, they do sometimes intercultural philosophy. Only the trouble is, intercultural philosophy is not institutionalized. That means you don't get a job. That means, and that's why I say this generation, students sitting here, you can change it. The change may come from the ministers, education minister, or the university authorities, but they are not very much interested. So maybe some of my colleagues, they are not interested in, my goddess, we are doing Greek and medical and modern, and then you have to learn a bit of Sanskrit and do Chinese and this and so they don't want it. And more or less the ministerial level, they are not very much interested. You just imagine, in Germany there are 6 or 7 million Muslims, and this is politically a powerful section of philosophy. Now in Germany, because the pressure from the road is so big, I normally criticize it, 6 German universities have 6 chairs for Islamic theology. And I told one of my colleagues, just we were taking our beer and wine, I said, come on man, when are you going to have a chair for Hinduism and Buddhism and this and that? So you just see in Germany, 6 universities have theology department, Islamic theology. So the pressure is not there, particularly from the side of philosophy. You know? So everybody wants to learn something about philosophy. Nobody is institutionalizing it. And unless some institutional form is there, these students, if they do their doctorate, this or that side, they want a job. And that is the trouble.
Eu acho que se a pessoa faz, mesmo ele vai encontrar trabalho, não vai deixar in institution. In institution, we don't find a job.
Yes, Richard?
He said that if someone does that, if someone really does philosophy interculturally, he's not really going to find a job, in fact, as things currently are, at least.
Yes, at present this is the case, that is true. But as I told you, the case in Vienna, this colleague of mine, He is a phenomenologist and also intercultural philosopher. A very fat and good book he has written, Interculturality. No? The trouble is, it is of very recent origin, this intercultural thinking. So it will take time. I told, for the last 2 days I am telling, I am an active pessimist. But remember, active, you know. I won't give up, but I'm not just a blueprint that all things will be all right. It doesn't matter. No. It may not. No? But that does not mean I should stop. So that's why I told you one sentence, before understanding, before trying to understand the other, if I say, oh no, these black people we can't understand. How do you know you can't understand? So first try, and if you fail to understand, then say, I can't understand. But to say a priori, no, it's impossible. I can't understand you, so I leave it. No? And that should be avoided. So I would, till my death, I will fight like this. You know, believing fully it may not. But the history says, heaven and earth, we are waiting. Don't you think? Heaven and earth, Christianity and all the religions. The heaven and earth, we are waiting. No? Even today. And so also many other things.
Anyone else like to make another question, comment? Well, then I would. First, regarding Carlos and, I'm sorry, what's her name? Her name. Margarita. Regarding Carlos and Margarita's questions, I would first like to say about what Carlos said. I think it's again another instance of this way of treating differently the two sides. I mean, even if, like you said, even if we restricted the canon to Western tradition, it's already a problem because we can't read everything anyway. And everyone is already saying that even what we think that is classical and important, we don't manage to read everything. I mean, I haven't read Heidegger or Sartre or any of this in my bachelor, and supposedly they are very important philosophers. So again, it's not a difference. It's not because it's intercultural that the difference is qualitatively different. It's just a matter of the same problem that we have to face anyway. So that would be one thing. And about your question, I think it's really interesting what you said, because I would think, I don't know if you would agree with that, because earlier we were discussing this idea that when we talk about cultures and about cultures overlapping, the concept of culture itself is broader than whether we are talking about nations or countries. Culture, it can also be a certain group of people, a certain group of a certain gender or what have you. And I think that this idea that philosophy is nobody's possession, the possession of no soul, of no culture, is not the sole possession of any culture, applies also in the sense that we can say it's also not the sole possession of a culture of white European men. And in that sense, you can also see use that to think how women also have made contributions to philosophy that also in the Western, in the Occidental side of the history of philosophy have been hidden or not recognized, even though they really made big and important contributions. So this would also be intercultural, although in another sense.
Yes, that is true. I mean, it has to be limited. There you are right. Only why this limiting the subjects or the topics, why should they stop just when it is European, non-European? One should open some way that the students are informed. There is another way of logical thinking, syllogistic thinking. That is, of course, even in Europe, everybody is not reading all the philosophers. Hardly any student or any one of us.
Any other question? Yes?
About that point precisely, I think I tended to be more sympathetic actually with the idea of just removing the canon. No canon. But, well, I don't know now. But because, well, in some way, it may also be important to have a sense of, well, we might need to have some authors to have in common and some references in common. See, I don't know much about it now, I'm doubtful, but yes, I agree with you in any way, in the sense that, yeah, of course, I also want many non-Western authors to be included in classes and universities. The point is how to do it, and one alternative is to simply enlarge the canon. Another alternative is simply remove the canon and let the decisions about which authors are more relevant be a matter of discussion between each department or each certain region.
Yes.
It could be an alternative. So I have to think more about it because now.
Yes. And that's a very thorny problem. That is true.
It's about this problem with the canon, and a little bit about the way to conceive academy.
Yes.
Because you're conceiving academy, it is in universalized fashion. It was made so because of imperialism. But maybe a solution. How is this academy to be done? How is intercultural philosophy to be made? Because one solution possible it already happens. Each academy, each department has a preference and a certain number of authors. We have here in the department many people who commentators of Descartes and of Aristotle, very good, and Hume a lot. We don't see Rousseau. I personally like Locke. I don't see here. So where would this be realized? Because academies specific, they are specific.
Yes.
So you could make the canon of each department have its preferences.
Yes.
So intercultural, where would it actually be?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. You know, that the problem is how to institutionalize it, how to teach it. You know, and you know, it was Karl Jaspers, and it many varied. There are different ways to introduce students in the subject which is called philosophy. So there is one, you start teaching about the system, idealism, empiricism, and relativism, all that. This is one way. Schools of philosophy. And the second one is person-oriented. Kant, Hegel, Plato, and all that. This is the second one. I personally prefer problem-oriented introduction to philosophy. Only problem-oriented introduction to philosophy. Everywhere in your university, you have philosophy teachers. They talk about causality, you know. And my request would be the same philosopher, whether he knows Sanskrit or Chinese, not. If he knows, it's all right. But even if he doesn't know, there are very good books in translation. He should inform himself. And when he talking about the problem of causality, then let him talk about Kant, David Hume, and this and that, and Nagarjuna, or even Buddhist causality, theory of causality. So also logic, syllogism. Then he should talk about these different theories, and then of course, Indians have this theory of syllogism, 5-membered syllogism. And this could be done, believe me, that this can be done only when idealism, realism, skepticism, that means we should not philosophize at the university level, person-oriented or school-oriented, system-oriented, no, just problem-oriented, idealism, realism, the nature of soul. So the nature of soul, and that is practicable, believe me. The same philosopher, he should inform himself, what do the Buddhists say about causality? Whereby at present, natural scientists are better Buddhists in philosophy than the philosophers. You know, Varela and all that, they have done so good works on Indian philosophy. Their causality, for example. Modern physics is full of praise for the theory of causality of the Buddhists. And this is really sad that the blindness of academic philosophers, and that is it is good that you ask. The best way would be to problem-oriented philosophizing, And then the mono problem is there. Then of course you can take Kant and Nagarjuna and this and that from everywhere. And then to say, no, the moment we take Nagarjuna, that is too much. No, it doesn't lead to indigestion. I said that won't do. Just to say, oh, we have three-membered cynicism in Aristotle. Oh, these Indian philosophy has 5. It will take just 1 or 2 lectures more, nothing else. I have been suggesting this thing in Germany for the last 20 years, but no, I must have some position, But anyway, but that is quite practical, But this would be better. This could be done. This is feasible. This can be practiced.
Anyone else? Then I would also like to make a short comment on what you said, because as far as I understood, because you were taking on Carlos' question, you said, well, assuming that we have to choose either way, aren't we doing already intercultural philosophy, because this department gives some philosophers and other departments give other philosophers, each department is going to make a choice?
We keep within the Western tradition.
Yes, but
so
precisely.
Really
yeah, but that's what I wanted to say. Like, it's not because you have to make a choice that each department is going to make a choice that this choice is going to be intercultural anyway. The matter is that you can make a choice and still be intercultural in the sense that, well, you might show more Nagarjuna than Jainism or Buddhism than Hinduism, but it still doesn't start from, it doesn't go from the starting point that there is only philosophy in the West. And
I was thinking about the constitution, the people in the academy. We have classes with the professors and they have their research. We always gotta get introduced. We have a professor, he's giving another lecture on something else, and he doesn't stop speaking about the car, doesn't stop speaking about Nietzsche, because it's proficiency. It was just the point. How do we do? One solution I thought was that we do not prefer Western, and one of the professors might prefer Nagarjuna and gives him just as the way we have Hume. But I think the problem-oriented, I think that's very much the soul of the usage of the word philosophy. I think it pretty much solves the problem. It demands a little bit of the revolution of the curriculum,
yes.
But it's feasible.
Actually, that's probably the way that some professors were attracted to other philosophies. Now, I remember an example and there are some examples like this. A professor in Bogota, I don't remember his name now, in my hometown. He was a specialist in Fichte and, well, German idealism. And precisely when he told me once, and that was long ago, he told me that he was in a Fichte conference in Europe, and he was informed because of this about Kyoto school philosophy. He got interested in that, and he incorporated that into his research interests now. It's much easier to do that when you are problem-oriented, actually.
Yes. That's more feasible. Everything will be very, very complex, that is true, but it's more feasible. But the trouble is, many of our colleagues, they are not so much interested in it. Then they all of a sudden they talk about, I don't know Sanskrit. No, but there are so many philosophers of rank. They also don't read Plato in Greek language. Majority of our students don't read it. And then when it comes to Nagarjuna, oh, I must know Sanskrit. But when it goes to Plato, no, I read in translation. So there is a practice which is there. Of course, it is better if everybody knows all the languages. But that won't be possible that way. And the practice of the students here in Germany, at least I know, that 95 or 98% of the German students, they read Greek philosophy in translation. Why not then Indian and Chinese, African and all that? No, these are all lame excuses, believe me. But that is good. That I learned from Karl Jaspers. He just has different ways of introducing history of philosophy. And the one is problem-oriented, and that is what I like, and it is more feasible. It is practical. Only my philosophy teacher must have the courage and also the intention, you know, to inform what is causality in the case of Buddhism. That's why the best way would be that we teachers of philosophy, we should inform you about these different models. Second, third level, oh yeah, I like Nagarjuna. That is my cup of tea. But the first thing is just to tell you, that's my experiment, you know, Kant. 4 history of philosophy books, and there are 4 Kants. The students will be happy. And they were, the one girl student came to me and said, oh, that is all right. I am not going to ask the question, who understands Kant actually? All the 4, and none of them. This is. But this is, no, truth must be known to one person, in one language. This is fanaticism, you know? This is fundamentalism. Where the practical, empirical situation is that there is no one Kant, there is no one Hegel, and there is no even one Christ, a Buddha.
And I also think that this idea of thinking about the curriculum in terms of problems, yes, it's also very attuned to the idea of intercultural philosophy, because I believe one of the best reasons to do philosophy interculturally today is precisely the problems, because we have problems that can only be solved when we really have this dialogue between traditions, because each has its own contribution to solve this, to discuss these very problems.
Yes. I was just thinking, if Carlos and other colleague, when we think about intercultural philosophy in the Western terms, like when we put ourselves just inside a Western framework, we start, like Carlos said, like the first thing we think about is what should we read, but what should we read, or the curriculum is not all of it. I think sometimes, like when we are trying to really find these overlapping places, like these points of convergence, we need to think in the best way to form, to generate like good professors, like to revalue the role of the professor, like you, for example, like the role of like a professor in Western like culture is not it's not like it was before, you know. It's, especially in Brazil, we don't have the formation, the pedagogy or the methods,
yes,
and everything, you know, to deal with these things.
Yes, and you are right. That is true. But you know, things have to be solved in some way. You know, there is an internationalization of the students' body today. Students are far international in every sense of the term, you know, in nearly all fields. But the trouble is that institutions within the country, they are not very open, you know. So you may know a lot of Buddhism and this and that, and you are begging for a position, yeah? Just to earn a few, just some money. And that is the saddest part of it. Yeah?
I studied in Kathmandu for a year in an MGPH institute.
Oh.
And there was like professors from universities like Harvard, like Boston College, like many places, and also like Buddhist lamas and Nepali teachers and international students in the same place. But the main problem when I come back is the recognition of that.
Yeah.
You know, like I spent more than 1 year studying there, and the recognition by the university, like if I went to any place in Germany or any place in England or in the US, like people will put the head carpet on my front.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna enter the university here. It's like the colonized mind.
Yes.
But in this case, it's like not.
Yes, I mean that is what I told you, that there is no future. You just beg for a position, you know, that is, so it becomes like something exotic.
Yeah.
So you did something exotic, you know, that is yoga and whatnot. And the trouble is that with Indian philosophy, Europeans are, particularly this movement, you know, Bhagavan, and what is the name of the other man? Transcendental meditation, and then all of a sudden somebody just, the law of gravitation is no more there, you know. Psychologically it's all right, but some of the yogis believe, you know, and it is nonsense. That's how I told you, some of my students say you are so critical about India. Majority of the Indian yogis should be treated psychically. Majority of them are really psychically ill, believe me. You know? I mean, not only, of course, many of them, you know, this government, this government is, sorry, this present government is Hindu fundamentalist, you know. Majority, the thousands and thousands of these yogis, these sadhus, you know, they just march for this government. They are anti-Muslim and this and that. Of course, yoga, the discipline, yoga metaphysics, yoga practice, this is something fantastic, no? If you take it seriously and don't do magic. But you just take the case of Bhagavan, no? Fine, now God knows. And he just had his own planes, no? Or Maharshi Mahesh Yogi. I once met him because one of my students was his secretary, you know, in Bonn. So, but anyway, so they have found out these Europeans are quite rich, they have a lot of money, let us go there. In India, nobody runs after them, you know, but they make a lot of money in Europe, even today. You know? And yoga has become a type of bodybuilding. You know? Nobody thinks, just if you read the Yoga Sutra, the first two conditions of doing yoga, they are ethical and moral. Asanas, you know, that is the third and the fourth. You know? That means to control your desires and this and that. This is yama, niyam. These are the two. They are really moral training. And majority of the Europeans who are doing yoga, they never care about these two positions, yam and niyam. No yam and no niyam. They just sit. They just want to sit like Buddha. This is nonsense. It is not needed to, if your legs are paining, don't sit like Buddha. That is not necessary. You know, how can a very, very fat man sit like Buddha? This is the trouble, you know, that thing. And what happens? In the eyes of the public on the road, oh, this is Indian darshan, this is Indian philosophy. And it kills me sometimes, you know, but I can't control it. That is Indian philosophy, Indian way of thinking is this yoga. And there are teachers, you know, there are Germans, they say, oh, we are taking India seriously. See what to do. Anyway, we are complaining, you know.
If no one else would like to make any comments or questions, I think we can end now. Once again, thank you so much, Professor. It meant a lot for us to have you here. We are very glad that you gave this lecture and the seminars as well. I'm sure everyone enjoyed. I would also like to thank very much everyone in the organization, Jefferson, João, Professor Lilian, Professor Sacrini, Lincoln. Thank you all for making this possible. Now, now we are going to dinner. Nós vamos jantar aqui na USP mesmo, no Sueden. Se alguém quiser se juntar a nós, é só seguir a caravana.